Let's take a moment and talk about those things that are variable, because those are equally important to us if we're going to be successful, is recognizing the variability of life itself, and certainly the variability of business. They did a study not too long ago about why businesses fail, and that the center of the study wasn't necessarily the failure of the business, but those businesses fail because of the technological changes that occurred within their industry. And so why was it that some companies were able to take those technological changes and become very successful, while other companies would not evidently see those changes, would not change with the demands of their environment, and that they would over time fail? And what they found, and it was surprising to the researchers, was that it wasn't that those companies did not see the changes. They saw the changes as clearly as those that embraced it and pursued those changes. Those people who allowed their businesses to fail, their attitude was the problem. They thought that they could sit there and that even though their industrial environment was changing, that somehow it wouldn't affect them. It is denial in its worst form. It's delusional. It is insane in its own little way. Is that they thought that somehow the world could scramble itself around them, but the storm that they would be in wouldn't touch them. And they would sit there year after year as their businesses collapse. This is an extreme form of denial. But you know what? It's not an unusual form of denial. Henry Ford, who created the Ford Motor Company, that became the largest motor company in the world. Henry Ford penetrated a market that was just emerging, the demand for automobiles. First-time buyers buying cars for the very first time. Ford created the assembly line. He did a lot of innovative things. He was able, because he was riveted on that first-time buyer, he was able to drive the prices down in the car market. And so that he would sell an $800 car. That's how much those early cars, the Model A, I think it was, not the Model A, it was the Model A, was $800. You know how much his profit margin for an $800 car was? You don't have any idea? It was $2. His profit margin was $2. That means that he had to make up his profit by selling lots of cars. He had to sell lots of cars, and he was going into a new market, and he was selling lots of cars. He was also selling a lot of tires and things like that that would back up those $2 profits in the cars themselves. And it was his business model, and allowed him to become unbelievably successful. But the business changed on him. General Motors saw it first. General Motors saw that all these first-time buyers had purchased the car, and now they were ready to buy a second car. Ford only provided one car, and that car was all in one color. Every car Ford produced was black. And so as a consequence, he provided a cheap car that was black. He could have looked out his window and saw multicolored cars driving around the streets to realize that his market had changed. But he didn't want to believe it. And no one in the company knew how to tell him that the market had changed. And they finally sent a relative of his because they were afraid that they would be fired. They thought, okay, this relative is going to be immune from Henry Ford's wrath to go in and say, we've got to do something different because GM, General Motors, they're segmenting the market into different sections. In other words, the Chevrolet was for poor people entering the market for the first time, and then he moved up to the Oldsmobile and the Buicks and the Cadillacs. So he began to segment the market in terms of how much money people had and how much they were willing to pay. And so as a consequence, they started to eat up Ford's market. And so this relative was sent in to tell Henry Ford, oh, we have to change because our market has changed. And you know what Henry Ford did to his relative? He fired him on the spot because he didn't want to change. That as astounding as that is, as you watch the business history of that moment, progress, and you see General Motors take over the position of Ford, is that Henry Ford never truly changed. So riveted was he on staying right where he was at in his first success. In other words, he did certain things that provided his first success, and he couldn't migrate off of those principles because he didn't recognize that the variables that surrounded his business had changed, and that he needed to change with it. And that right now, in Newskin, you have leaders that have welded themselves to the process that they engaged in at the beginning of their careers. They know what allowed them to be successful, and that even though they can look around and see that the world of communications, the world of transfer of information being transferred from one person to another, that world is exploding. It is changing dramatically. It is changing the way that business works, and it changes the way information is disseminated. And yet those leaders are not paying attention to how that will intersect into their business. And I'm telling you right now that we are at that moment. We are at a transitory moment where the business is going to change. And I'm going to give you a heads up here. Newskin does $3 billion